The blizzard came down from the north without warning, the way January storms did in the BC interior, fast, flat, and without any particular opinion of what lay in their path. Willa Trent had driven the stretch of highway between Peachwood Junction and Crane River enough times to know every dip and curve. She'd done it in August heat, in October fog, in the early dark of November mornings when she had to be at the mill office by 6. But she had never done it with bald rear tires in a whiteout. And when her truck coughed twice and died at the bottom of the long grade near Coldwater Creek Bridge, she sat for a moment in the sudden quiet and thought, of course. She'd had 10 months of course. The heater died with the engine. Outside, the temperature was already sitting at -22, and the snow was coming sideways. Willa sat with her hands in her lap for 30 seconds. No longer she was practical like that. Then pulled on her second pair of gloves, turned up her collar and stepped out into the road. Crane River was 4 kilometers ahead. The nearest farm was Cormac Finley's place, 1.5 kilometers down a gravel-side road she could barely see. She'd passed his laneway sign 100 times without thinking much about it. Most people in Crane River had stopped thinking much about Cormac Finley years ago. He came to town once a month, said what needed saying, and left. He'd been doing this for 9 years, ever since his wife died. He was not unfriendly. He was simply somewhere else. Even when he was standing right in front of you. Willa didn't think about any of this as she walked. She thought about keeping her face down and her feet moving. And when the cold stopped hurting, somewhere around the 30-minute mark, somewhere had packed into the seams of her boot, and the snow had packed into the seams of her boots. She understood that was the part to worry about. She stopped thinking after that. Cormac was driving back from his north fence when his headlights picked her up out of the white. A dark shape crouched at the shoulder, one arm braced against a highway marker. He was out of the truck before it had fully stopped. She looked up when he crouched beside her. Her face was gray and her lips were dark with cold, but her eyes were focused. He'd seen hypothermia before. During his years with the RCMP, she was close. "Can you stand?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then she didn't. He carried her to the truck. She woke up on his couch an hour later with a wool blanket over her and a wood stove burning 3 feet away. Her boots were off, her wet coat was gone. Someone had put thick wool socks on her feet that were not her own. Cormac Finley was sitting across the room at a narrow table, drinking tea, and reading a water-damaged paperback, as if this were an ordinary thing. "You were close to real trouble," he said, without looking up. "I know." Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "My truck died. I saw it on the way back. I'll tow it in the morning." He turned a page. "You can have the couch. There's soup on the stove when you're ready." Willa sat up slowly. The room was plain and clean. Rough pine walls, a row of hooks by the door, a single shelf of books, a man's reading glasses folded on the table, the kind of space that had been lived in quietly for a long time and had stopped apologizing for it. "You're Cormac Finley," she said. He looked up then. "I know who I am." She almost smiled. "I'm Willa Trent." A pause. He knew the name. Everyone in Crane River knew the name, one way or another. He set down his book. "Do you want soup, Willa?" She did. She had been the head bookkeeper at Crane River Timber for 6 years. She was good at it. Meticulous, honest, the kind of person who flagged irregularities the first week she found them and documented every one after that. The irregularities had started long before she arrived, in the payroll accounts that funneled through a subsidiary company she hadn't been told about. But when it came apart, Dale Prentice, the mill owner's nephew, the person who had set it up, pointed at the most recent person who'd had access to the accounts. He pointed at Willa. She was let go on a Thursday. The RCMP came to her house on a Friday. The investigation lasted 4 months and ended with no charges, because there were none to lay. But by then the story had already settled over Crane River like ash after a fire. People didn't talk about the investigation. They talked about the fact that she'd been investigated, and Dale Prentice was still at family dinners. Willa had stayed. She didn't know where else to go, and she refused to leave as if she'd done something wrong. She picked up contract work where she could find it. She kept her own records. She waited. 10 months in, waiting had started to look like the rest of her life. She stayed at Cormac's property for 8 days. The first 2 she spent mostly sleeping, waking to find soup or tea set near the couch. Cormac moving around the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to need much and had stopped missing what he'd let go. He didn't ask her questions. He told her where things were and then left her to it. On the 3rd day, she was well enough to sit at the table. Cormac came in from the barn and found her staring out the window with both hands wrapped around a mug, watching a whiskey jack hop along the porch rail in the white morning light. He noticed the way her face changed when the bird paused and tilted its head directly at the glass. Not quite a smile, but something opening, like a window unsticking after a long winter. He didn't say anything, but he made note of it. On the 4th day, she was hanging his coat by the stove to dry. He'd come in from the water trough soaked to the wrist, and a folded piece of paper slipped from the inside pocket. She picked it up without thinking. It was written in neat, careful handwriting, the kind of script that still had the self-consciousness of youth in it. Dad, I moved to Penticton in September. I have a spare room if you ever decide to stop avoiding the rest of your life. I'm not angry, I just miss you. Rosie. The letter was dated 6 months ago. Willa folded it carefully and set it back on top of the coat. She didn't mention it. But she thought about it through the rest of the afternoon, and in the quiet before she fell asleep, and once or twice after that. On the 5th day, she offered to do something useful. Cormac handed her a ranch ledger without comment, 3 months behind because he hated the work. She spent the afternoon at the table while he repaired a broken stall in the barn, and when he came in at dusk, she had everything sorted, and a short list of 2 discrepancies she'd found beside it. You overcharged yourself on the November hay delivery, she said, and your fuel receipts don't match what's recorded. He looked at the ledger, then at her. I'll call them. I already wrote out what to say. He read the note she'd left, looked at her again. You didn't have to do that. I was sitting here anyway. They ate in quiet after that, but it was the kind of quiet that had stopped being empty. On the 6th morning, Willa woke before dawn to the sound of an engine turning over. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked out the frost-edged window. Her truck was running in the yard, exhaust curling white into the dark air. Cormac was walking back toward the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. She was at the door when he came in. You fixed it, she said. He hung up his jacket. Fuel line was cracked, nothing serious. When did you? Yesterday evening, after you'd gone to sleep. She stood there. He had gone out in -18-degree dark to fix a truck that wasn't his, for a woman he'd known less than a week, without mentioning it or asking for thanks. I'll pay you, she said. No. Cormac. No, he said again, simply, and went to put the kettle on. Later that same afternoon, while she was reading on the couch, he came and set something small on the table beside her without a word. It was a carving, a whiskey jack, no bigger than her fist, made from pale birchwood, its head tilted at exactly the angle the bird on the porch rail had held it 3 days ago. The detail was patient. The wood was smooth as riverstone. She picked it up. He'd already gone back to his chair. You made this, she said. You watched that bird for 3 minutes straight, he said. I counted. She turned it in her hands. He must have started on it the same day she'd watched the bird. She thought about saying something equal to the gesture and couldn't find words large enough, so she set it carefully on the windowsill where the bird had been and looked out at the yard instead, because she didn't want him to see what was on her face just then. On the 7th day, she drove into Crane River alone to check on her employment appeal at the labor board. She pulled up in front of the post office with her chin up and her coat straight, because that was the only way she knew how to do it. Lorraine Skegg was behind the counter. Lorraine had run the Crane River post office for 23 years, which in a town of 800 meant she had processed, at one point or another, almost everything that mattered to almost everyone who lived there. Their tax forms, their medical correspondence, their letters from lawyers, their packages from children who'd moved away and didn't come back. She knew, because of this, that she held a particular position in the town's life. She had never been modest about it. "Willa Trent," she said, when Willa came through the door. She said it the way some people say a word they've been saving. "I'm checking for anything from the labor board," Willa said. Lorraine took her time. 2 other people stood at the far end of the counter. A young man from the hardware store, an older woman Willa knew from the library. They had both gone very still. Nothing from the labor board. Lorraine's hands moved through a sorting tray. There was something from an accounting firm in Kelowna. "I assumed it was related to your situation." "My name was cleared," Willa said, 4 months ago. Lorraine set the envelope on the counter and left her hand on it. "It's just that people remember what they remember. The Prentice family has been in this valley for 40 years. Their grandfather built half this town." She looked up. "I'm not saying anything, Willa. I'm just saying it takes a certain kind of nerve to walk in here expecting things to go back to normal." The library woman looked at the floor. The young man studied his phone. Willa picked up her envelope. "Thank you, Lorraine," she said. She was almost at the door when it opened from outside. Cormac came in. He was moving carefully. His right knee had been aching in the cold for a week, but his face was composed. He nodded at Willa. Then he looked at Lorraine. "I heard what you said from outside," he told her. His voice didn't rise. "I want to say something back." Lorraine blinked. "Cormac, I've known Dale Prentice since he was 12 years old. I've known him to be dishonest since he was 12 years old." He looked around the small room. "If anyone here wants to weigh reputations, I've got time." Lorraine's mouth thinned. "I suppose you'd know a great deal about her, now, after a week at your property. She nearly died on the highway outside my gate. I brought her in. That's what people are supposed to do." He let that sit for a moment. "Willa Trent is an honest person. I've watched her work with my own records. That's my opinion, and it's not changing based on what the Prentice family finds convenient to believe." The post office was quiet enough to hear the weather. "I can speak for myself," Willa said. "I know you can," Cormac said. "I'm speaking for myself." They drove back in the same truck. Neither spoke for the first 10 minutes. The road was clear after the storm, and the sky was that hard, brilliant blue that only came in the BC interior after a blizzard had wrung itself out. "You didn't have to come," Willa said finally. "I was in town for feed anyway." She looked at him. "You came for the feed after. I saw your truck come in behind mine." He kept his eyes on the road. "Cormac, I didn't like the thought of you in there alone," he said. "That's all." She turned back to the window. The mountains were white and close. She thought about the letter in his coat. "I just miss you, Rosie." And she thought about a man who had spent 9 years learning to need nothing, and still couldn't stand the thought of someone facing something difficult without anyone beside them. That evening, she said what she'd been working up to for 2 days. "You're a good man," she said. She meant it plainly, without flattery. "This town knows your name and they respect it. You should find someone whose name doesn't make people go quiet when she walks through the door. Someone you don't have to follow into post offices and defend." She looked at her hands. "I'm not that person. Not right now. Maybe not for a long time." The fire shifted in the stove. Cormac was quiet for a long moment. I spent 9 years finding reasons to stay alone, he said. Every one of them was reasonable. They're still reasonable. He looked at her steadily. But I'm tired of things that only make sense. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He paused. I'm not looking for easy. I'm not looking for convenient. I spent 22 years married to a woman I would have walked through anything for. And I've spent 9 years since then not looking for anything at all. And then you were in the middle of the highway in a blizzard, and something in me just, he stopped. Decided. That's not how it works. No, he said, but it's how it happened. She shook her head, and her eyes were bright, and she was not going to let them do anything embarrassing. You should call your daughter. He went still. The letter, she said quietly. It fell out of your coat. I'm sorry, I didn't read all of it. A branch dropped snow against the window. Her name's Rosie, he said, after a while. She's 22. She lives in Penticton now. He turned his mug in his hands. When her mother died, I was right here. I was physically present. But I wasn't anywhere that mattered to her. She needed a father, and I gave her the general shape of one instead. She left the day after she turned 20, and she was right to go. His voice didn't break. It only got quieter. She wrote me that letter in July. I've been meaning to call. 6 months is a long time to mean to do something. Yes, he said, it is. She thought about her own months. The first 2 after she'd been let go, barely leaving the house. The 3rd and 4th filing the appeal and waiting. The 5th and 6th when waiting had started to feel like the rest of her life. I kept a page, she said. He looked up. From the mill accounts. I made a copy of a ledger page before they locked me out of the system. It shows transactions going through 4 months before I was hired. I didn't bring it forward because the only lawyer in Crane River plays golf with Dennis Prentice every second Sunday. She exhaled slowly. But there's a labor board hearing in February, and I was going to try. What's stopping you? She looked at him. Nothing, she said. Not anymore. The Crane River Volunteer Fire Hall held its annual winter potluck on the 3rd Saturday of January, the way it had for 34 years. It was not a formal event. People brought cabbage rolls and squares and slow cooker chili and argued about whose recipe was better. And in a town of 800, everyone came because there was nowhere else to be and because January was long and the warmth of other people helped. Willa almost didn't go. She went. She was sitting at the end of a long table, her plate mostly untouched, when Lorraine Skegg arrived with her husband and settled 3 tables over. Within 10 minutes, Lorraine had begun saying something to the people around her. Quietly, in the way of someone who wants to be overheard but not caught, and the people around her kept glancing toward Willa. Willa set down her fork. Then Noreen Hatch sat down across from her. Noreen was 73, and had run the Main Street Diner since 1987, when she and her late husband had opened it with borrowed money and a second-hand oven. She had known Willa's mother. She had known Willa since she was 7 years old, coming in for hot chocolate after figure skating on the outdoor rink. She had short gray hair and reading glasses on a silver chain and the expression of someone who had lived long enough to be done with things that wasted her time. Lorraine's at it again, Noreen said pleasantly. Let her, Willa said. Noreen looked over her shoulder, then back. Dale Prentice came into my diner in October, she said. He was on his phone. He didn't see me in the back booth. He said something to whoever he was talking to about keeping the Kelowna accounts separate going forward. She folded her hands on the table. I wrote it down that same night. I don't know if it helps, but I wrote it down. Willa looked at her. You could have told me this months ago, she said. I could have, Noreen said. I was afraid of the Prentices. I've been afraid of them for a long time. She met Willa's eyes. I'm less afraid than I used to be. Across the hall, Lorraine's voice had lifted just slightly. The words didn't carry, but the tone did. That particular carrying tone of someone performing something for an audience. The hall door opened. Cormac came in. He hadn't been to a town gathering in at least 4 years. He came in quietly, scanned the room, saw Willa, and came to stand near her table without sitting. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing. But his presence had a kind of weight to it, the way stillness does when it belongs to someone who has been through enough to choose it deliberately. Lorraine finished saying whatever she was saying. The people around her shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Noreen stood up. "It's an interesting thing," she said, in a voice that carried clearly to 4 tables in every direction. "When the person everyone's so busy discussing is the one who kept the best records, and the person everyone's protecting is the one who didn't." She looked directly at Lorraine's table. "I've watched Willa Trent work honestly in this town for 6 years. And I've watched some other people work very differently. I'm at an age where I'm finished pretending I don't know the difference." Someone at a nearby table nodded. The young mechanic from the garage, whose taxes Willa had helped sort 2 years running for free because the forms confused him, put down his fork. "She helped my family when she didn't have to," he said. "To no one in particular. That's what I know." The woman from the library said, "Same." Lorraine's expression had gone flat. Cormac said simply, "She's the most honest person in this room. That's not opinion. I've watched her work. It's observation." The hall went quiet. Willa stood up. She wasn't sure what she was going to say until she started saying it. "I don't need anyone here to believe me," she said. Her voice was steady. "I stopped needing that a while ago. But I'm done making myself small so people feel comfortable. I did the work honestly. I kept my own records because I knew something was wrong long before anyone was looking, and I'm still here." She reached into her coat and took out the folded ledger page. She'd carried it since November, the way you carry something you're not ready to use, and held it out toward Roger Kellum, the town accountant, who was standing near the serving table with a plate in his hand. "Roger, the irregularities in those accounts go back 14 months before I started at that mill. I have documentation. The labor board hearing is February 9th. I'm asking you to look at this." Roger set down his plate. He walked over and took the page. He unfolded it. He read for a long moment. "This would have been 2019, he said quietly. "Yes," Willa said, 14 months before I was hired." The hall was quiet enough to hear the January wind working at the eaves. At the table across the room, Dennis Prentice was looking at his plate. Dale, who had come with his uncle, was studying the floor. Neither of them said a word. Lorraine Skegg left 20 minutes later, before dessert was put out, with her husband and her sister-in-law. She did not say goodbye to anyone. Willa sat back down. Noreen put a butter tart on her plate. Cormac sat down across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the noise of the hall came back around them like water filling a space. "You didn't need me to say anything," he said. "No," she said, "but I was glad you were here." He looked at her. Something in his face settled into something else, quieter, more certain, the way ground settles after a long freeze finally breaks. "I'm going to call Rosie tomorrow," he said. Willa picked up her fork. "Good." In the morning she made coffee, while Cormac sat at the kitchen table with his phone in both hands, not looking at it. The snow outside had softened overnight, and the light coming through the cabin windows was white and easy, and without judgment. He dialed. She moved to the far end of the kitchen and kept her back to him, because some moments deserve their privacy. She heard him say, "It's Dad. I know it's been a while." A pause, his voice lower. "I know." A longer pause, the kind where real listening was happening on both ends. "Is the spare room still?" "Yeah." Something that might have been a laugh, small and rusty with disuse. "Yeah, I'll come in the spring." When he set the phone on the table, Willa turned around and handed him his mug. She didn't say a word. There wasn't anything to say that the coffee didn't already cover. He took it with both hands, and she saw his shoulders drop half an inch, and she thought about Rosie somewhere in Penticton, probably sitting with tea of her own, allowing herself to hope. They drove into Crane River together that morning in Willa's truck, the carved whiskey jack sitting on the dashboard where she'd placed it the day before. They went to Noreen's diner and sat at the corner table, and Noreen brought them both the breakfast special without asking what they wanted, because she already knew. Outside the window, Crane River went about its business. Somebody shoveled a walk. A pickup idled in front of the hardware store. 2 children ran between the parked cars in their snowsuits, shrieking at each other for the pleasure of it. Nobody stared. Or perhaps they did, and for the first time in 10 months, it simply didn't reach her. Willa wrapped her hands around her mug. The little birchwood bird caught the morning light on the dashboard. Pale and patient, its head tilted, watching. Cormac was reading a menu he had already memorized, in the careful way of a man who was learning, slowly, to be at ease in the open. She thought about February 9th. She thought about Roger Kellum and the ledger page, and what came next. She thought about Rosie in Penticton, 22 years old, who had written, "I just miss you," and waited 6 months for an answer, and gotten one. Outside, the mountains stood white and close against a sky that had no interest in yesterday. The coffee was good. The window was warm. The whiskey jack watched the street with its head tilted, the way birds do when something has caught their attention, and they have decided quietly to stay.